Hey there, everyone. Welcome to Broadband Deployment News. There is a requirement in the broadband, in the BEAD Notice of Funding Opportunity for a 25% letter of credit, and that's something that could possibly lock out some smaller operators. I'll be right back. We'll take a look at that. Thanks for joining me. Rick Uzzi here with Broadband Deployment News. So I want to take a look at this. This is a blog post that was in a blog on something called Connect Humanity, why the letter of credit requirement could sink BEAD. This image is repeated below, so I want to look at that. It's a good image, good explainer on this. So first, what's the problem and what are a letter of credit and all that? So BEAD requires recipients, and this would be your internet service providers that are not the states, but the internet service providers, to provide a letter of credit for 25% of the grant award. But the states have to require this, in other words. So this is something that is required of the states to get this letter of credit from their subgrantees. Alongside the additional 25% match, this capital barrier will shut out a huge number of ISPs. So in BEAD, there's a 25% minimum match requirement that can be waived in a few circumstances, such as a very high-cost area, I believe. But in general, any internet service provider that wants to be getting funds from the state has to have a 25% match, skin in the game, so to speak, on whatever amount of money that they get. Plus, they've got to have this 25% letter of credit, which in essence is also that amount of money, but that has to be locked away and can't be used. So the match obviously can be used toward putting broadband in the ground or up in the air, or however they do it. But that letter of credit is basically just taking money and putting it aside in case that there's a financial situation or financial problem with that subgrantee. So that then obviously increases the burden on the amount of capital that the ISP is going to need. So as it says here, small and community-centered ISPs, minority and women-owned businesses, nonprofits, and municipalities that the program claims to be targeting will be most affected. So in the BEAD program, there is kind of a preference for not-for-profits like municipalities and electric membership co-ops. It mentions here they want to try to aim funds toward minority and women-owned businesses, which could be smaller. I mean, they could be large as well, but in general, you're looking at maybe they'd like smaller companies to be able to do some of this instead of some of the large internet service providers that we have. This is counter to that goal, is what he's saying here, and it's true as far as this is going to be a real challenge for smaller ISPs, as opposed to the big ISPs that are doing this kind of stuff all the time, that have the financial resource to be able to take good portion of capital and just set it aside and not have it do anything other than basically be insurance. And that's kind of what it is. So you see here the Notice of Funding Opportunity issued by NTIA encourages the participation of non-traditional providers such as municipalities, cooperatives, and nonprofits, tribal governments, and utilities. It also calls for small women-owned and minority-owned businesses to be prioritized. Yet the program includes requirements that are so difficult for these entities to meet that, as things stand, the vast majority of them have little chance of securing funding. What is the letter of credit? BEAD applications must come up with a letter of credit issued by a qualified bank for 25% of the grant amount. This is a guarantee to the grant administrator in this case, a state broadband office, that there is liquid cash in an account that it can draw or can claw back should the applicant not deliver on their grant requirements. And I was going to show real quick what this looks like in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. So you see here, this is on the Notice Funding Opportunity, pages 72 to 73. Each eligible entity shall establish a model letter of credit substantially similar to the model of letter of credit established by the Commission in connection with the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, or RDOF. So there is a letter of credit opportunity in RDOF, and all providers that won money through RDOF had to get this letter of credit as well. There's some differences in where RDOF was a reverse auction, and providers were saying how much they would be willing, what they would be willing to bid, or how much support, I guess, they would be willing to take from the government, kind of bidding that number down, reverse auction. And then if their bid was approved, then the final two things that they had to do was get a letter of credit, and they had to have a bankruptcy letter, which it mentions here as well, something that states, you'll see here, that states that those funds can't be used for bankruptcy purposes. So you see here, Application process: prospective subgrantees shall be required to submit a letter from a bank that meets eligibility requirements, and there's specific requirements. So the bank has to meet these requirements as well. So it could be the small community bank where one of these smaller businesses may do business with, may not meet those requirements. And they must be committing to issue an irrevocable standby letter of credit. Prior to entering into any subgrantee agreement, each prospective subgrantee shall obtain an irrevocable standby letter of credit, which shall be acceptable in all aspects to the eligible entity or the state, and in a value of no less than 25% of the subaward amount. So again, the state has to require this. The state needs to decide if it's acceptable, and it needs to be at least 25%. In no event, however, shall a letter of credit be less than 25%. It talks about the fact here that the states could adopt rules which the subgrantee may obtain a new letter of credit or renew its existing letter of credit. So that's valued at a lesser amount. I think that's talking about where, because these things need to be renewed constantly over the period of time that these deployments are going to be taking place. So, if the subgrantee, if the ISP has deployed a good part of the network, or if there are certain milestones that they're reaching, then the state has some flexibility on changing that a little bit. So, for example, if they've awarded funds and part of those funds have been used, then they don't need to get a letter of credit for funds that have already been used, that kind of thing. But it's saying in no event, however, shall a letter of credit have a value of less than 25% of the subaward amount. So that would be, I guess, the first letter of credit. I'm assuming in year 3, when there's certain milestones met, that could be adjusted. That's the only reason I could see that they have that statement in there. Prospective subgrantee shall provide with its letter of credit an opinion letter from legal counsel clearly stating the bankruptcy court would not treat the letter of credit or proceeds of the letter of credit as property of the winning subgrantee's bankruptcy estate. So that, again, is very similar to what is in the RDOF. And in RDOF, this was all taking place at the very end when the FCC said, okay, we have reviewed your long-form application and we are going to award the funds to you. So you're ready to authorize, but before you're considered authorized, you have to get in the letter of credit and the bankruptcy letter. So it may be the same thing here where the state, once it is ready to award the money, may say, okay, your final 2 steps, you need to get these 2 things into us. So I would not be surprised if it's the same there. So again, that describes what the letter of credit is, and it says to receive a letter of credit, applicants will be required by the issuing bank to provide collateral. In most cases, this will be cash equal to the full value of the letter of credit. That means ISPs hoping to secure BEAD funds will have to lock away vast sums of capital that will be untouchable for the full duration of the bill, likely several years. So again, this is money that's not going to be used other than insurance for, I guess, for the state as well as for us as taxpayers, that this is money they're putting aside so that we know that, they're not going to go into default and then suddenly this money has been wasted. But we'll cover the whole idea of, some options here, because there is a reason for this. So there is a good reason for this, but maybe there's better ways to do it, or maybe there needs to be some leeway for these smaller operators. Banks will also charge applicants a fee for this letter of credit, typically 2 to 5% of the letter of credit amount annually, adding hundreds of thousands of dollars to the cost of a network build. And this is on top of the match requirement. To be clear, this letter of credit is separate and in addition to BEAD's match requirement, which demands that applicants contribute a minimum of 25% to the total build cost. So with a 25% letter of credit plus a minimum 25% match requirement, hopeful applicants for BEAD funds will need to front millions of dollars. So again, if you think about a smaller provider, not the big guys are probably used to doing things like this, and they've got capital on hand that they can put aside and do these kinds of things. But you think about a small operator, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to do this. So they're thankful that they're going to be able to get maybe some funds from the government to fund a good portion of this. But then they've got to come up with not just a match, and it's going to be expensive, but then in addition to that, really pretty much twice that in order to have this letter of credit standing by, and they can't use that money. So that's just going to be locked away and sitting there. That's money that they have to come up with. Consider the following example, and this is a good example that he runs through here to kind of show you the impact of this. An ISP aims to build a broadband network costing $10 million to connect an unserved community. They must start by securing a minimum $2.5 million match. So they're going to get $10 million in funding from, let's say, BEAD, but then they've got to get $2.5 million, that 25% as their match. Then they'll need to raise $1.875 million to collateralize the letter of credit. In other words, that's cash that they got to put away, so they've got collateral for that letter. Finally, add around $200,000 in interest and fees to be in the running to secure a $7.5 million BEAD grant. The provider will need north of $4.6 million. Many simply won't apply. So, some of that money they won't actually use. It'll just be sitting there. And I guess once this is all over, they get it back. But other than fees paid, but still, that's something that it's something that they have to lock away their capital for that. You can see here again is just visually. You got 10 million. 7.5 million is really what they're going to get because I got a 2.5 million that they're going to be chipping in themselves in the match. And that match can be, there's not just money. I mean, that match could be in-kind contributions. If it is a utility like a EMC, that, some of that can come from what would be pole access rights and those kinds of things and other infrastructure. So there's some things that can ease the pain a bit depending on who the provider is. But in some cases, they don't have those kinds of assets. Then you got the 1.9 million letter of credit collateral, and you got your approximately 200,000 interest and fees. So you're seeing here the 4.6 million that's needed, or it says here that's 61 cents for every dollar. These capital demands create enormous barriers to all but the best funded providers. Perhaps most concerning of all, the letter of credit requirement does little to demonstrate a provider's ability to build robust infrastructure. It simply tests whether a provider has deep enough pockets to lock up valuable working capital over multiple years. And that's true. There's nothing in here inherently that says that the provider, could be a large company that's got plenty of money to put aside, but maybe they've never built a broadband network. That does not really have any say as to whether the provider could do a good job. The result is a Herculean thumb on the scales for the large, well-funded incumbent providers that have historically failed to serve all Americans, even when subsidized to do so. Now, I've got to push back a little bit on that because, we're kind of judging, some of the sins of the past, so to speak, on broadband money. I mean, there have definitely been mistakes made, and definitely there's been providers that haven't done exactly everything right. But, we have to remember that the definition for broadband has been going up over time. So when we've allocated funds to companies, they did what they could afford to do at the time, which let's say was putting in DSL or upgrading DSL speeds, those kinds of things, because fiber was just, the technology was just not quite there yet as far as being easily and economically put in. So, when we were talking, and the speeds didn't require it, so it made a lot of sense, I guess, to not put in fiber at the time. And I don't think anybody was thinking, hey, you need to put in fiber at the time. We weren't thinking about the future so much. So when the definition of broadband was 4 meg by 1 meg, DSL, okay, well, we'll put DSL in here. So a lot of the funds, everything that we were funding back then a lot of it was going towards DSL. There might have been some cable stuff and whatnot, maybe some wireless, but a lot of it was DSL. So providers that put that in, suddenly it's like, well, we gave them money and they put in bad technology. Well, that was the technology that at the time was economically viable, plus would serve what we said was needed for broadband at the time. So again, I don't think people were screaming that, hey, you can't put in DSL because that's not going to take us into the future. A lot of people thought it would. There were, ADS or VDSL and other kinds of DSL technology. It's like, wow, this is going to get faster and faster. But I mean, we're talking, now we know, okay, copper lines, not good for the future, fiber, good for the future. And now, as we spend this money, if you have, I would not say that, they say that the best people to do this would be your smaller operators and maybe new businesses or whatever. But really, the big guys have just as much right to this, to be able to do this, and they certainly have the experience to do it. And they're not going to be putting in inferior technology now. I mean, they're going to be, if they get funds, they're going to be putting in fiber, and they know how to operate fiber networks. And you can argue whether they're the best as far as keeping prices down and the best as far as support. I would argue that they're not. Because they tend to be, big behemoth companies. They're not generally located in communities. They've generally operated in places where they don't have a lot of competition, and that might be the case here as well. If you give a big operator lots of money in a rural area, then again, they're going to be the only operator there, and they're going to have lots of tools to keep competitors out, lots of leverage that they have. So I understand that. But to be fair here, big operators certainly are capable of putting in the right technology, and today they will be putting in the future-proof technology. They'll be putting in fiber. Even cable operators that get this money are not going to be putting in, unless it's completely right adjacent to their to their service area. And even then, I don't think they would do it. I think if it's a greenfield area, they'd be putting in fiber and not DOCSIS technology. So by steering so much money to large incumbents rather than to small to medium ISPs, best place to end the digital divide. And again, I don't know that they're necessarily best placed, but the administration risks repeating the mistakes of the past decade, in which the U.S. government spent $54 billion on broadband programs, which went overwhelmingly to the largest providers, resulting in just a 1% increase in Americans connected. And again, that kind of goes back to my prior point, so that if you measure it based on today, again, if the definition of broadband back then was 4 by 1, then when we raised the definition of broadband to 10 by 4, I think might have been the next step. I can't remember. And then 25 by 3. Each time you raise the definition of broadband, suddenly you have more and more Americans that are not connected. So you can't really look at who's unconnected today versus back then, because the number changed. So that's one thing I would argue with here. And then again, as far as who's best, municipalities are a good option in an area where you don't have a provider now, and they're going to want to cover their community. So I'm talking about a city. So a city's going to want to cover their community, but they're generally not going to go outside of their city boundaries to connect up other people. They might, but in general, they're trying to serve their citizens in their community that pay taxes to them, right? And they try to keep the price low, and people are paying taxes, and they try to keep the price low because it's like a utility in a sense. But then outside those areas, you've got vast areas in certain states where you've got lots of farms and communities that are spread out, where you don't have a large metro area. You've got small towns that can't really afford to do this. Then you've got counties. So a county government might make sense for a county government to do this, because they cover the whole county, and that encompasses small towns and all of those areas in between. Then you've got electric membership co-ops. They're a really good resource, because they tend to cover a county or multiple counties. Plus, I think different than the county government, they're familiar with infrastructure. County governments don't tend to have any kind of utilities kind of things. You got cities that do that, and you've got electric membership co-ops do that, because obviously they're providing power. So they've got power poles generally, and conduit and rights of way and all kinds of stuff, and they have a relationship with pretty much every single person in the county or wherever their coverage area is. So they are in the best place, I think, to serve some of these very remote areas, maybe more so than the big providers, and more so than, let's say, an independent telephone company that can make a case for it in a small town and a few surrounding areas, but not necessarily the whole county. So there are different pros and cons to people doing this, but certainly the big providers, if they're in a area of a state, and they can then cover another big swath of an area that normally they could not make a case for economically, then they are certainly in a good position to be able to extend their network, edge out, or go into new areas, because they have the financial resources to do it. They have the expertise to do it. They tend to provide really good speeds. And the only thing where they really lack is sometimes customer service. And again, pricing sometimes from a larger provider may be higher, because they've got the public companies trying to make a little bit more money. So that I would make a case for is maybe not the best for them. Bottom line, letter of credit requirement is the wrong tool for this program. And while we need to get more capital into building broadband, the $42 billion in BEAD grants require that more than $10 billion are sitting idle in escrow amounts and not being used to buy equipment, lay fiber, and train the next generation of broadband engineers. And all of that is very important. And that is a lot of money to just be sitting there. As I said, insurance. And it's really insurance for the taxpayers of the United States and the states themselves, where we want to make sure that anybody that's getting this money is financially secure. And that's the idea. That it's a worthy goal, but the question is, are there better alternatives? And it talks about one here, finding alternative solutions. Let's be clear. The requirement comes with good intentions. Nobody wants to see billions of dollars of taxpayers' money handed to providers that default on projects and fail to deliver the broadband so many desperately need. There's a balance to be found, to mitigate this risk while honoring the program's aim to broaden the pool of awardees and fund community-oriented networks. And that's absolutely true. But while the program mechanism should be geared to protect underserved communities from being let down, the letter of credit risks stopping them from being served altogether. The NTIA needs to course correct so that when states start issuing grants, They have the freedom to fund proposals and providers best able to connect communities rather than those simply with the most capital behind them. And again, I would just point out that in some cases, the large providers may be the best candidate, or certainly on an equal footing as some of these smaller ones. So then the state would be looking at it and going, okay, we've got a big provider. They certainly can do it, financially capable. They've proven they can do good broadband in the past. They're going to deploy fiber. They've got the resources. Then we've got another provider here that not as big, but we feel like they maybe can provide the service, can provide better customer service, a little bit more local, and possibly a lower pricing, those kinds of things. So their states then are going to be balancing who it is, but certainly the large providers are in a good position to be able to do this. And they have the capital, so that's a true statement. There are alternatives to explore, from tools such as performance bonds to having less onerous requirements for smaller ISPs, nonprofits, and municipalities, to expanding the types of entities that can issue letters of credit. There are ways to protect taxpayer dollars while ensuring that BEAD can live up to its promise. So they do need to look at this, and there is a requirement also in the program that you need to have financial statements that are provided. If I remember, I think it was right after the section. I linked to the BEAD NOFO. I linked to this article, and I linked to the BEAD NOFO in the description of this video. And I believe right after that Notice of Funding Opportunity paragraph, it talks about financials. So you need to have audited financials. So that's a protection right there. So if a company has very strong financials, they've been in business for a long time, if they have experience deploying broadband, so they're showing that, then maybe there should be some leeway that states have that say, okay, we've looked at the financials, we've vetted this company, and we're confident that that this is a company that can do this. And maybe there's something where the state would have to then somehow guarantee if the small companies goes out of business, in order to provide, in order to maybe take that chance in order to provide good quality broadband to allow some of these smaller entities to be able to do that. And then he mentions the performance bonds here. There's a link right there that you can go to, and basically shows you the difference of performance or surety bond versus a letter of credit. And the big difference, there's a little higher cost, I think, on the upfront here. On this surety bond, customers pay a premium of around 0.5% to 10% of the bond, so it could go higher, versus 0.5% to 1% of the well, actually, this is of the full amount, so maybe it is. And I'm not a finance guy, so but this is of the bond amount. So it might be lower with the letter of credit on the front end, but you don't have to, as far as costs go, but you don't have to put aside all that capital. That's the big thing. So right here you see working capital impact on the performance bond. Businesses simply pay an annual premium to purchase a surety bond, so there's no impact to their working capital, cash and cash equivalents. This aspect of a surety bond is a major advantage for cash-strapped businesses. So again, these companies that aren't the big guys that have lots of cash to put aside, this would be a good way to go. Whereas working capital impact on these letters of credit, banks require collateral deposit to obtain a letter of credit, as we talked about. The funds on deposit are reserved and unavailable to the business as long as the letter of credit is outstanding. Obligations will not release a letter of credit until the liability tail of the license is expired, often as long as 3 to 5 years after the license is expired. So that's a lot of money that's locked up for a long period of time. So this does sound like a good possibility here, this performance bond, as opposed to this letter of credit for these smaller operators especially. So again, maybe this is something with, I think as the states look at this and the NTI looks at that, I don't know what the leeway is for the state, and I certainly don't know if the NTI will do that, but it does sound to me like that's a good alternative. So again, vetting these companies, because it's a worthy goal to have the letter of credit in there, but it's not necessarily the best thing for small operators that don't have a lot of capital sitting around. So trying to figure out another way around that, especially for these smaller operators. And I guess it should apply to the larger ones in that case. I mean, I don't know if you want to put your thumb on the scale that much for the smaller operators, and then the larger operators have issues. So maybe these things need to be made available for both. You can do the letter of credit, or you can do the performance bond. Maybe the letter of credit would be better for the larger companies. I don't know. It sounds like maybe it is as they compare this. And then again, states being able to determine, we vetted this company and we think that they can do this job. Because again, it's all about experience. It's about your financial strength, not necessarily whether you can take 25% of how much you're going to get and put it aside and never use it. That's a difficult barrier right there. But if you've got the financial wherewithal to do this based on the money that you get and your match, and you've got the experience to do it, then these companies should be allowed to do that. So maybe the states can somehow work with the NTIA and get that done. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate it. If you're not subscribed to our channel, go ahead and click the subscribe button, click the bell to be notified. If you found this interesting, if you give me a like on the video, I'd appreciate it. Thanks very much for joining me today, and I will see you soon for Broadband Deployment News. Take care. Bye-bye.